Hello and welcome to another episode of the Boring AppSec podcast. Today we're chatting with Vivek Ramachandran. Vivek is the founder of SquareX, a browser security company, but we probably best know him for being the voice, face, and the founder of Pentester Academy, or Security Group as you know it. Now, if you were a pentester or a security researcher through the 2010s, it's hard to have not encountered Vivek's videos somewhere. In addition to founding multiple companies, he created comics, invested in companies, and mentored a whole lot of security professionals in India and across the world. If you're building a startup or just curious about building in the space, this episode has the maximum insight per minute. Listen in. Vivek, welcome to the Boring AppSec podcast.
Thanks, Sandesh. Thanks, Anshuman, for that very kind introduction. Yeah, super excited to be on the podcast and looking forward to speaking with both of you.
Great. We have a bunch of questions for you, but why don't you start off by telling us what you're doing at SquareX right now?
So, SquareX, we founded SquareX roughly 2 years back, and this was almost 2 years after I exited Pentester Academy, took a little bit of a break. And really, the problem that we are trying to solve over here is browser native security. So the thought process was, if you look at attackers, they are primarily targeting employees when they're online. And employees are spending 90% of their time on web browsers, right? Chrome, Edge, Firefox, whichever. And at this point in time, our firm belief is that the browser is the new endpoint. So just like 10, 15 years back, you had EDRs solving endpoint security problems. SquareX is trying to pioneer a BDR, or a browser detection response system, aimed at solving, client-side web attacks in the browser.
No, that's super exciting. And I know we have a bunch of questions for you on SquareX down the line. But before we get there, I want to get a little deeper, into the origin story of Pentester Academy, right? When you started, cybersecurity was still pretty new in India, right? There were probably a few people in Lankan kind of hacking away and doing stuff, but it wasn't like a mainstream industry in India by any means, right? What kind of got you to starting Pentester Academy, and kind of how did you go about building it?
Yeah, I think I'll give you a very scenic view on what really happened. Roughly around 1996, if I remember, probably like 15, 16 years old, computers were still not as popular in India, right? Like people just used it if they required it for work and all of that. So I was very lucky that, my parents got me a computer, and there's a backstory to that as well. And post that, I was actually preparing for my engineering exams, and that was the time when I saw that, this big DDoS attack had happened on Yahoo, Alta Vista. This was probably the year 1999 or 2000. You might not remember, but then I started reading, and I saw that this hacker by the name of Mixter, he had created this attack tool called Tribal Flood Network, or TFN, and that is primarily what was used to bring all these networks down. So, 16-year-old, young, thinking in my mind, how did this one guy bring down all of these massive websites to their knees, right? So started researching, ended up downloading the source code, opened it up, understood nothing. Asked a neighbor who was going to an engineering college, and he said, you know what, this is C programming, and there's a bit of assembly in there as well. So that is how, while preparing for my engineering exams, I started learning, C, networking, some of those basics all by myself, just so that we could, pick something up and see, hey, how did all of this work? And some of the readers may not appreciate, this was a time when there was no GitHub, GitLab, there wasn't YouTube. So the only real way was to look at other people's code, tinker around, make changes, try stuff. Fast forward, I think I was very lucky that during my engineering was able to focus on cybersecurity, did my final year project and all of that, in it. And then I went into the industry, worked for a couple of startups, discovered some attacks. And the time when I had discovered this wireless attack, which was called the Cafe Latte attack, at that point, the other folks at Airtight Networks who were working with me, they basically said, hey, Vivek, how do you do all of this? Like, how do you write this code? How do you write, a packet injector? And I quickly realized that there was a lot of tribal knowledge I had gained over the years, which, hadn't been put systematically anywhere. So the very first class I actually took was an in-person one at Airtight Networks for a bunch of developers, just to show them how to write these tools.
Nice.
Yeah, and till then I really hadn't tried teaching, but everybody came back and said, oh, you explain things so well, this is amazing. And then very soon there was a next group who came to me and they basically said, hey, could you teach us again? So as crazy as it sounds, just as an experiment, I just said, why don't I record some videos? and just share it with you guys rather than doing this over and over again. So ended up recording, posted it on a site called securityfreak.net, which became securitytube.net.
Mm.
Uh, and then eventually what happened is probably a year down the line, I just decided that I wanted to do security research full time.
Mm.
And that is really when I moved back to my parents' home, sat there, put up securitytube.net, which eventually became Pentester Academy. And that is really how the whole thing kind of like begun.
No, that's a great story. So you did developer
Yeah.
security training before developer security training was cool.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
For what
No,
it's
that
worth.
yeah. No. That's really interesting. But when you did security research, was there kind of a reason why you kind of also chose like the teaching part? Is that because you got it on track and just saw more exciting? Was there enough security research to be done? Was there a career to be made in security research at all at
Yeah.
that time? And if there was, then would you have, hypothetically even done pensions?
Correct. That's a great question. And I think back in the day, there was none, right? Nobody was, pursuing what today we know as pure security research, which is companies weren't really paying to sit down, find vulnerabilities in systems. That really didn't exist. And some of the younger readers might appreciate this is way before the word even bug bounty was ever coined, right? Or you even had access to products to try these things out. So for me, what had happened is, I discovered the cafe latte attack, broke up, web cloaking, and I did a bunch of other security research. But then I quickly figured that, I love this. I was super passionate, for what it's worth, maybe even good at it. But it was not possible for me to pursue this within the company. So when I came back, my I think the CTO of the company was also my boss. He said, Vivek, all of this is amazing, but I think, let's just get back to our good old like engineering once again. So for me, having spoken at DEF CON 2007, getting that world stage, seeing that I was able to compete with people at the world stage, I think was a big confidence booster. And then I told myself, look, if all I could do is teach people on the side and, make some money, the exchange rate works in India. And this would just allow me to do security research and go speak at DEF CON and Black Hat probably every year. So, Sandesh Anshuman, the way the whole thing started is I started traveling around the world and I used to do in-person classes, primarily in Europe, actually, primarily in Belgium. There's a couple of training institutes who invited me. And that allowed me to kind of make some cash on the side to continue to build securitytube.net for actually 2 more years before I launched any kind of paid training, in the online world. And just to close on that, the reason I had to do it is after 2 years of, I don't know, traveling like 40, 45 countries back to back, literally never even coming back to India, I realized that this was not like a life plan, right? So very abruptly, I just said, you know what? I put out all these videos on securitytube.net. Let me put out a paid course. What is the worst that can happen? And everybody told me, including my parents, he's like, hey, you have an Indian accent. These are all those days, right? Like, there's nothing in there. So you have an Indian accent. The recording has sounds of cars and crows. Do you really think? And I know, as a parent, they just wanted to safeguard me from not feeling like let down or negative. But the best thing I did was just put that, video out, send out a massive message to everybody. And that's really how everything began, at least the online stuff.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty fascinating, Vivek. The fact that you've been a content creator even before content creation was a thing as well, right? Like it is 2025, and we see people are creating good content, right? On you name it, like vulnerability, discovery to mitigation, what have you. So I guess my question is twofold. Well, first of all, is like, do you kind of miss creating that content, and do you have any plans of starting to create content again? So now that you're a founder of a company, so that's the first question. And the second question, I guess, is do you have any advice for anybody looking to create content in 2025, based on your experience? You've actually built a successful company around this. Yeah, anything that you can share would be greatly appreciated.
Yeah, I think great questions. So absolutely. I mean, I know I do miss creating that content, saying hello all, one more time in my videos. And one of the things I've realized is, with respect to SquareX, because browser security is also in its nascency, we've realized that a large part of what we have to do is also educate the market, educate CISOs, customers that we are speaking with. And you brought up a great point. Internally, we are now creating an initiative where, me and a couple of other folks that we've hired on the team are actually planning to put out systematic courses on, client-side attacks, what are the problems over here, why existing defenses fail. And the very first act that I did was actually go back and speak again last year at DEF CON, main stage, talking about how existing secure web gateways, etc., could be broken. So that is the first part. The second part, Anshuman, what I've realized is every 10 years, I think, as the younger folks come in, the way content is consumed completely changes. So to give you an idea, the time when I had started Security Tube Pen Tester Academy, I think, and you guys might relate to this, is we love that super in-depth technical content which could just last for hours. But at the end of those 10 to 12 hours, you really felt like, you know what, now I actually understand wireless security. Now I probably understand, as an example, Metasploit. Now, what the time when at the very end, when I was, about to sell Pen Tester Academy, I realized that for the younger folks, what's happened is this is a TikTok generation. And, people have very little to kind of like, no focus time. So if you're taking more than a couple of minutes, people just tend to lose attention. And this is really where I feel anyone who's trying to build content for, today's folks should probably focus on short, impactful, highly dense, bite-sized content, and then try to see how he can probably spin things around it. I've seen very few people have the patience to go through a 30, 45, 50-minute video course. And you can see, right, TryHackMe and many of these, other companies who are now all starting up, much of it is just bite-sized content. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point. I think there's also a paper. It's called "Attention is All You Need." I keep seeing that being circled, and I can totally relate because we have this podcast as well, and I've seen people, they look at our reels and videos, but they don't actually listen to the podcast. So it's really important for us to find those, like a few, like a minute or a minute 30 seconds to basically sort of share what is it that we are speaking about in this podcast. So I think that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, I don't think there is any easy way to sort of promote your content that you share. But yeah, I totally agree with that. So
I guess the only exception is if you're stuck in Bangalore traffic, in which case you can just go for time.
listen to the podcast.
Honestly, you'd probably watch a movie then. Bangalore traffic actually takes that much of time. So
yeah. Maybe we test on something really interesting. Okay, so the whole Indian accent in the video thing is funny because we put out some product videos and we got a feedback to say, hey, maybe it's better to get somebody a little more neatly to kind of talk about it. And I'm like, no, but this is who we are, right? So we never change that. But just that kind of brings me to the next question, right? So one of the aspects of kind of cybersecurity in many ways is a very global market, at least the defense part. There may be some things on the attack stuff which is more geopolitical. But if you're building an application security, there's nothing geopolitical about it, right? It's just But how do you kind of think about, I'm a founder who kind of, builds for a global audience from India. But in general, how do you kind of think about, being in India, building for the world, or being in Singapore like you are now, and then building for the world, right? So how do you think about, how founders should go about it? What are some things to watch out for, and what are some things, where it doesn't matter what part of the world you're in?
Yeah, great question. So, and this is something, I was lucky enough that in Pen Tester Academy, I did it from day zero onwards, which is no matter where you're building, make sure that you are in your mind deciding to compete with the best in the world. And what I mean by that is don't build a product and immediately run to a local customer, whether you're in India or Singapore or wherever, and say, you know what, I'm going to first try to get these 4 or 5 local customers in Bangalore, and then I'm going to go ahead and expand and eventually go to the US. The big fallacy and mistake is regional customers may have very, very specific needs. Now, whether we like it or not, at this point, the US still continues to lead the technology curve. And what tends to happen is if you are able to win with a product in the US market, generally you kind of won in other markets because most of them are follower markets, right? And I can tell you, I speak with so many CISOs around the world. I mean, right now, actually, I'm in Palo Alto. I've flipped my time between Palo Alto and Singapore. I was pleasantly surprised to actually see that most companies, even in India, above 5,000 users, almost have an identical security stack as what you would find, in their US counterparts, right? Everybody has an EDR. People are using SASE, SSE solutions and whatnot. So the biggest mistake I've made founders kind of do is spending too much time on a local market. You build something and you say, why don't I go to a Flipkart? Why don't I go here? What you don't realize is many of those companies would happily accept a global leader, but may not be willing to accept a local startup. It is just the mindset which kind of still needs a bit of tuning. The US market I found is very different. You could go to some of the largest companies in the world and they want to listen to startups. I can tell you, I've been speaking to Fortune 50 CISOs the last few weeks. And the moment I'm on a call, the CISO himself would come and he'd be like, hey, Vivek, educate me about what is actually going on first. Because they know that the larger companies are going to hide everything behind a, kind of very thick veil. Because the larger companies take a long time to innovate. And mostly in cybersecurity, they just end up buying a startup which is innovating at some stage.
Yeah.
So my advice is think global on day zero. Call yourself a global company. If you're building a product company, immediately go take a business visa, go spend time in America, start talking to potential customers in the US first, try to corroborate the story probably with local customers as well. The critical mistake, and I won't name startups, I've seen many Indian cybersecurity startups do, is spend the first year and a half just focusing on India. And look, every field is going to mature really fast, because what that means is there are going to be, your international competitors, and they will start gaining ground in America. So after some point, when you enter the US market, there is no novelty anymore. They'd basically say, oh, are you a cheaper ABC? Versus if you go in early, they'll look at you and say, hey, this is amazing. Like, we've never seen a company go about building something like this. Can you tell us more? So the second most important thing I've realized is you can build tech out of, anywhere. And India is a great place to build tech out of. But go to market, I've always realized you want to hire people who live in that market, who understand that market, who know the social ins and outs. So even for SquareX, we have a sizable team in Singapore and India. But at this point in time, my entire focus is, we've hired a CRO, he's hiring his sales team, we're hiring our marketing folks. So the entire go-to-market sits over here, because the messaging, the reach outs, how sales is done, all of that is very, very localized. It is not something which is easily transferable, as a knowledge. And as tech people, this isn't very intuitive, right? Because you could technically build the exact same tech no matter where you're sitting. Doesn't matter whether you're an engineer in Bangalore or an engineer in Palo Alto, right? You're using the same libraries, the same things. But yeah.
Yeah, Vivek, so I have a follow-up question to that. So you mentioned that, uh, startup founders should especially, travel abroad, come to America, learn about the market here. I've also heard the flip side where, companies that try to build cybersecurity solutions in countries like India, they see that there's not a lot of demand as such, right? So how, like in your experience and in your opinions, how do you deal with that? Where if, so let's say you're a startup founder in India, you're trying to build cool technology, but you don't really find customers in India itself. So how do you deal with those kind of situations?
Yeah. You mean like them when they go to the US, they're not able to get like enough?
No, I mean like people who are trying to build startups in India itself, and if they're trying to find customers in India, but if you compare the technology advancements, like I feel India is still a little bit behind. So how do you try to sell the product that you're building in India to Indian customers when there's no demand for it yet?
Yeah. Very difficult, right? Because I think cybersecurity is a second order function. And at the very same time, cybersecurity, the best way I've always equated it is to car insurance, which is, if you go to somebody and try to sell them a new insurance, there is no direct mapping to ROI. And India, whether we like it or not, at least local Indian companies, they are still very cost sensitive. And much of cybersecurity driven in India is compliance requirements, not really a real need to be secure, which unfortunately kind of like, doubles up the problem even further. Now, the only thing that I've seen so far where we've had good success is the litmus test in my mind is just talk to the CISO or the head of security and ask them which products they bought. So the moment you get to hear that, they've bought, CrowdStrike, Zscaler, roughly in your mind, you should know what price points they're sitting at when it comes to India, and there's a geographical pricing disparity. It gives you a clear idea of, is the organization progressive, right? Now, in comparison, if all of a sudden you hear that they're using some antivirus you've never even heard, and we know some names I'm not going to take, then you immediately realize that this is not a company where the management is deciding to allocate anything to cybersecurity. Now, the other hack that I've figured is, a lot of times you can actually go in and say, you know what, you don't have to buy. I'm just looking for a design partner. And as a design partner, we can publish a case study along with you. And I can tell you a lot of CISOs love this because, look, they've gained so much of experience, knowledge, and they also want to talk to people and give that information away. Unfortunately, there aren't too many avenues to do that. So that is a nice hack where you can talk to them and say, look, maybe you're never going to buy this, but if we could work together, let's deploy for free. Let's look at if this is really even solving a problem, and you can be my design partner. We can quote you. I can do a podcast with you online, and this doesn't, create any issues at all because you aren't buying anything. Now, what may inadvertently happen is, if your product really has a need, then once they deploy it, once they see it in action, they may actually get convinced that this is something interesting enough for them to make a purchase. I always say that budgets can be found. And as a startup, early days anyway, you aren't haggling too much on price. I mean, that itself is a big debate, whether you should price it high, price it low, and all of that. But the most difficult thing is to break in. The second big thing I would say is, look, and I can just tell you from my own experience, in pen tester, I was always in my man cave. The only avatar that anybody would have seen of me is in those videos, and sometimes in isolated conferences where I decide to go. I'm extremely private, almost to an extent, very inward, very shy. All of those were my traits all the way to kind of selling and exiting Pentester Academy. So when I started SquareX, right, the very first thing that I realized was I would have to now go out, start talking to people. I really cannot be sitting, behind and just tell people like, let's just do a Zoom call. I feel a lot of technical folks, have this part of them, which is they just feel like being hardcore technical is good enough for you to lead a company. It isn't. 99% of all the discussions I have with CISOs isn't hardcore tech at all. Is more product positioning, the landscape, the know-how, which actually means you should be very, very comfortable jumping on calls, talking to people, listening to them, building a relationship. And I think I've learned this over the past 2.5 years. Is, how do you go about building that relationship, over time, making sure that you're helping them first, rather than expecting something. And a lot of technical founders are blindsided to this. And many of us actually also feel we can't do this, right? Because no, I'm not that guy who can actually go out, put myself out, right? So I think if you strongly feel that this is you and you aren't able to change, the most important thing is to also get a technical co-founder. I can tell you, I'll close with this comment to open up, follow-up questions. I've met so many founders who will tell that they tried to break into the US market, but they weren't able to. Is simply because, people cite a lot of things, including bias, whatever it may be. The high probability of what really happened is they just went to one or two people, they got rejected, and that was it. That was too much for them to take. And they said, why don't I just come back and focus on good old Bengaluru, right? Why don't I just focus on people I understand better? So anyway, I'll just pause there.
Yeah. No, I think couple of great points you made, right? So one is on, I've also found that even CISOs like talking to technical co-founders, right? Because they don't always just talk to people who don't understand technology. They're technical folks too, right? So I think it kind of makes sense, even if we're not, it makes sense to go and talk to those people, right? It's actually fun conversation. Yeah. In addition to kind of being important for your company. The second thing you said, which I thought was very interesting on the design partner stuff, right? So the one trend we've seen over the last few years, and I used to work at Razorpay, which is kind of like a very, very tech first startup, is that while from a business perspective and from a spending perspective, you're right, there's a massive delta between India and the US. On tech stack, modern Indian startups are comparable to scale and complexity to the Bay Area startups, right?
Yes,
so if you think about a Swiggy or a Razorpay or a Flipkart, etc., right? Their infrastructure, their coding standards, etc., are top notch. So they make for fantastic design, right? Because it's almost like you're, at least from a pure product perspective, you're simulating kind of, the environment in the US. Now, having said that, they may not have the scale, they may not have the volume and all that, and you're right about the business, but you're bang on about the design part of stuff. That's something that we've seen, work very, very well. It's just that you can't get comfortable and just say that, and you'll have to make it up at some point.
Exactly.
With other customers as well. Yeah.
And Sandesh, just to add there, right, the best thing if you wanted to build in India in cybersecurity is anything to do with development security, right? DevSecOps and things like that. I mean,
So many devs.
so many devs in there, right? Like they'll relate to that problem immediately. But yeah.
So I have a follow-up question. I think some of the advice that you shared for folks who are not based in the US is on point, right? Especially when it comes to going out and trying to sell the product or a company. So for people who are trying to start companies outside of the US, right? What are some things or advice or resources that have helped you personally, right? Like especially for people who are more technical, and how do you transition from a more technical role to somebody who can actually sell a company, build a company, right? Do you have any advice, thoughts, resources that you can share?
Yeah. That's a great question. So I'll break it up into two parts, right? One is I made it a point to listen to a lot of podcasts from very deep technical founders in cybersecurity, who ended up making like big security companies, right? George Kurtz is a perfect example. He was a very technical guy, built out CrowdStrike, the founder of Sentinel-1. And there are a lot of podcasts where they share their stories. Like even one of the recent one, I forget if it's called the Logan Bart show, right? Like he does Logan Bart, if I remember, or maybe I'm pronouncing that name wrong. I saw Jay Chaudhary, Zscaler's founder, went through the whole grind and all of that. Now, what really happens is once you see someone just like yourself going through that whole process and building a bigger company, it just adds a sense of confidence that this is doable, right? Number one. The second most important thing, and this is something I only learned during SquareX, is very early on, you should go start to build an advisor network. And advisor network exclusively in the US, right? And you should be able to be very resourceful, get really good folks to speak with you. I'll give you an example, right? Jeff Moss, the founder of DEF CON and Black Hat, is an investor and an advisor to SquareX. And I can tell you, I must have sent Jeff like 7 to 10 LinkedIn messages asking him for time. And then finally, Jeff relented and he was like, okay, Vivek, let's meet. Then I must have met Jeff 6 to 7 times before he felt convinced, in me as a founder and SquareX as a company, right? And now every time that, Jeff and I have any common overlap, I'm happy that he makes the time for, him to meet with me. I get his advice. Now, from there, what you can actually start doing is get a couple of pivotal advisors, but from their chain. So here's what I did. I said, Jeff, I love Jeremiah Grossman. We all learned so much from, White Hat Security, all the web security stuff we put out back in the day, right? So I said, could you make an introduction to Jeremiah? And Jeff made an introduction to Jeremiah. I met up with him last year at RSA. Him and R Snake, you guys may remember, the whole. So both of them came to the booth. Robert Hansen, both of them came to the booth. I had the honor of showing them the product. They were completely blown away. And, now Jeremiah is also an angel investor and advisor. And with his help, I ended up hiring the CRO because the CRO that I have right now, Dave Smith, he used to be the CRO at White Hat, back in the day. Now, similarly, I'll give you another example, right? Like I had invested in PingSafe, Anand Prakash, in the seed round. And Anand is a very resourceful guy, by the way. So I spoke to Anand and I said, hey, who all are there in your advisory board? I want to know the list. And he told me, hey, I have, Neeraj Arora. And Neeraj Arora used to be the chief business officer of WhatsApp before acquisition. So I met Neeraj and Neeraj said, look, I love you. I love what you're doing, but I'm not a cybersecurity guy, so I don't know. So why don't you talk to Rishi, who founded Dimisto, who sold to Palo Alto for, I think 650 million. And if you can convince Rishi that this is a good idea, I will come in and I will help you as well. I was like, okay. So then I spoke to Rishi. Rishi looked convinced, but Rishi said, I have to speak to 3 of my co-founders, right? Slavik, Dan, and Guy. You need to convince all of them because we all 4 of us invest together. So then it took me a month to 2 months to schedule, get all of them in. And then I told Rishi, I was like, who do you respect? So he told me Pradeep Aswani, he's amazing guy, created 3 VARs, sold it to multiple companies. So then Pradeep wasn't initially convinced. So I told him, give me one person you technically respect. And he said Gerhard Eschelbach, who used to be the CISO of the privacy vertical at Google. And then I spoke to Gerhard. So all of these guys are now angel investors and advisors to the company. So what tends to happen is 2 things. If you go target the best of the best, the people you respect in the industry, first is you hone your own ability to position the product, talk about it, understand how to convince others why this is something interesting, valuable, and hopefully a big company in the future, number one. And number two, there is a big inductive effect here. Nowadays, a lot of times when I go onto a call and the CISO looks at the names of advisors that we have, and we have almost 20 of them, he will immediately say, hey, Vivek, I actually know A, B, and C. And the whole call begins with a very, very warm, kind of environment, because he feels, you know what, my friends have invested in Vivek. So, Anshuman, to your point, I think a lot of founders, what you have to realize is, as an individual contributor, as a security researcher, you can take the world on all alone. If you're building a company, you need a tribe, you need people way above your punching category to be rooting for you, right? And the only way that can happen is if you make it a point, whether it takes 10 reminders, 15 reminders, to finally go in front of the guy and say, look, absolutely happy. I know it took a lot of time. This is what I do. Would be absolutely amazing if you could join the journey. Now, they themselves will then start introducing you to potential clients and people like that. So I give you a very long winding answer. And the big reason is I see very few people do this.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think I personally really appreciate that long-winded answer, because I think this is what new founders need to hear is, if you get rejected from one person, so in your case, you approached Jeff 6-7 times. So I think that a relentless, attitude of just keeping at it and I think part of it is also kind of dependent on how much you believe in your product, your idea, right? So no, I'm very thankful for you to share this advice to everybody who's listening to this episode.
And Anshuman, just to add one point, I'll tell you, right? Like PingSafe's founder, like Anand, right? Anand was introduced to me by Sequoia Capital's Roy, and he said, we are going to invest. And Anand said he was your student before, he wants to talk to you. So I spoke to him, and I just exited Pentester. And Anand spoke to me, very nice, very sweet guy. And he said, Vivek sir, do you want to kind of like put in an angel check? And at that time, I hadn't really done any angel investment. So I said, look, Anand, there's no need. I'll help you anyway. But then Anand kept at it. He basically said, no, I really want you to be part of the whole thing. And then I finally invested as well. I can tell you, there are so many founders who will drop me a LinkedIn message saying, here is a PowerPoint, take a look. Do you want to angel invest? And A, no one's going to entertain that. B, that is the only thing they send me. Or they send me an email. And if I don't respond, they come back saying, oh, can you please respond? So what you have to understand is that when you want people on your side, you cannot demand, because everyone who's worth getting on your cap table is probably ultra busy. And so it is very, very important for you to have a very, very kind of humble way to approach this and not take it personally when somebody doesn't give you a meeting or takes a lot of reminders. This is not a reflection of how they think about you. This is just the fact that they're so busy that you are not top of mind, and rightfully so, right? Like they have their own priorities.
Yeah, no, this is awesome advice. So thank you so much. I do want to switch gears because we have so much to talk about. So from your perspective as an expert in Wi-Fi and offensive security, I think that's where your career really began, right? From what I understand, what do you see as the biggest cybersecurity challenge organizations face today? And how do you see this landscape evolving in the next few years? With AI, being a hot topic these days, how do you foresee the impact of AI in the cybersecurity challenges that you're personally aware of?
Yeah. So break it up into 2 parts. I'll speak from the perspective of browser security, because now cybersecurity is so wide. That's what I've been looking at recently. So one of the big things that we found is almost all initial access happens today via employees getting targeted when they're online, when they're visiting websites, right? Almost all of us have, enterprise SaaS websites open like Salesforce, but we also have our personal Gmail open, social media open. And with hybrid work and all of that, this is just compounded like crazy. So one of the big things that we've seen is organizations have spent billions of dollars on security education, right? The big guys will have you do a questionnaire. The smaller companies will probably do some seminars and things like that. And that has never worked. So one big challenge we are figuring out is as endpoint security is starting to go ahead and harden local systems more and more. So it's very rare that on a managed device, you can just download a binary and install it anymore. It just won't work, right? And at the very same time, cloud providers are also spending a lot of time in, hardening cloud API services and whatnot. Really, what attackers have increasingly started focusing on is browser native attacks. So we've heard of, malicious browser extensions. We are hearing about OAuth, SAML hijacks, scope grant attacks and whatnot. So one of the big places which nobody has touched for a very long time, and this is just my thesis on the problem, is to be able to build a product residing entirely in the browser itself, compatible with any browser. So if we believe in the thesis that the browser is the new endpoint, then you need something sitting within the browser natively to kind of be able to do that. I actually feel this is a massive, massive hole. Every single CISO that I've spoken to identifies and relates to the problem. And, when we talk about what we do, gets overly excited. That is one. Now, how is AI supercharging both an attacker and defender standpoint? So what's really happening is at this point in time with AI getting better and better, I think attackers' time from a new attack to creating POCs is getting shorter and shorter. However, for an enterprise to roll out patches, that timeline hasn't shrunk because they still have to go through their whole QA process and make sure everything is done right. And see, an attacker can afford to, have an AI agent just iteratively try to, hit a server with a new exploit. And if it doesn't work, use the error, reiterate, and keep doing it. So I feel attackers definitely from an attack standpoint have, a leg up at this point in time. And this is something we are seeing. The second big thing which is happening with AI is ordinary people, non-technical people. We've relied a lot on our senses to decide what is true or fake, right? So at this point in time, pre-AI world, we'd look at all of us and say, you know what, Sandesh, Anshuman, and Vivek, these three guys definitely are there on the podcast. If somebody just calls you right after this, sounds like me, you say like, hey, Vivek, hey, nice to get a call from you. I think what's happened is AI and all of the deep fake is completely going to break how humans were relying on their senses to figure out online digital scams, right? Somebody calls you up, somebody, does a video call and all of that. The second big issue which is going to happen is with so much of AI generated content, how do you even know what is misinformation and what is really factual? So there is no place, there is no blockchain of facts, right? Non-reputable, something which cannot be, reversed and cannot be questioned. So think about it. Like today, somebody could rewrite, the entire focus of a space by just spamming hundreds of different blogs with AI agents. So that is one. I think from a pure defender standpoint, what really is changing in a very, very big way is a lot of the SOC, log analysis, all of this with LLMs, everything is starting to get automated. So I also feel there is going to be a big impact on what the next generation jobs look like when it comes to cybersecurity people, because most cybersecurity folks are in the operator mode, right? You're running those pen tests, you're looking at logs. I wouldn't say those jobs are going to go away in the next year, but 4 or 5 years out, I think something will tangibly change. So yeah, attacker standpoint, defender standpoint, and purely job market standpoint.
Yeah.
Those are my thoughts.
Yeah. Before we get into AI, I think the browser stuff is very interesting because, the way browsers are being used has dramatically changed. I think because of SaaS, almost everything now is on the browser. But browser security, man, it's still, every time I work with an enterprise on, just working with them, they still have those weird proxies that go through and slow everything down. And just the experience is terrible, right? So not only is security not top notch, it also the available security solutions are making usability harder. So I think here, I think it's time for the new gen.
Exactly. And
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead, Sandesh.
No.
Next
I
question.
was just trying to add one because
Yeah.
I know he has like
And
30 questions for you on AI.
yeah,
So,
yeah, go ahead. I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, no. So I totally agree with the future in the next 4 5 years, where people who are, so like you said, folks who are in this operator mode where they're analyzing logs or they're triaging alerts. I think these are the kind of roles that could probably be automated and should be, in my opinion. In your opinion, how should cybersecurity folks try to deal with what is going to change in the next few years? Do you have any
Yeah.
advice?
Yeah. And this is just based upon, the last 25, 30 years of me just being in a technology space. What I've realized is as technology is progressing, there are fewer and fewer people who understand the fundamentals. And the best example I can give is, during our time when Java programming had come, right? And you had programmers who started with Java but never learned C and assembly, never fully understood how memory management and, some of the lower constructs work. I think what's going to happen, Anshuman, is in this AI first world, a large number of the workforce is going to get introduced at a much more higher layer where they completely lose touch with how the fundamentals of systems work. So my 2 cents is going to be in the next few years, people who have those very, very strong fundamentals, who are able to look at an AI's automated workflow and say, you know what, this is crap, this doesn't work, this is probably a hallucination, this wasn't really prompted perfectly, is simply because they understand the nuts and bolts of how the lower end tech actually works. I think those are the guys who are going to be really sought out, because for a good amount of time, maybe the next 10 to 15 years, I think AI is going to be built by, human assisted experts, right? Like folks like you and us who understand the space can actually take a problem, take the AI tools and figure out what makes sense to be automated and what still needs to be algorithmic or manual or whichever. And unfortunately, I'm actually seeing that most of the folks entering in cybersecurity are entering in those like top layers rather than more fundamental layers. So my advice to anyone is focus rigorously on fundamentals. Like there are so many people who at this point, if you just, ask them, how does an EDR work? Like how does syscall monitoring work? Right? They would have no idea. And being so far away, all they would be doing is looking at an automated feed of AI logs, right? So, I mean, what good of a SOC analyst are you going to be if you're just looking at second order analysis and not questioning why something looks preposterous because it doesn't make sense, right? Like what AI just threw at you.
yeah, I think you make a good point, right? I think the one kind of framework I try to tell people is that for the longest time we said, learn by doing, right? So we just say, hey, if you want to learn something,
Yeah,
you solve a problem and you do that. Now it's kind of flipped because learning by doing is too easy almost, right? Because you can take a
exactly.
task and actually do it because AI do most of it for you. And it will be geared not to
Exactly.
use AI to do it because, then you're behind and then you're slower among everybody else, right? You have to use. So now it's almost like you have to learn for learning's sake. And
Exactly.
LLMs are really good at teaching as well, right? So I
Yeah.
think, I sometimes see kind of a regression to saying, hey, do not use LLMs, which I think is also bad. I think that also doesn't work. But I think the way we teach people has to change, right? We focused a
Exactly.
lot on saying, hey, small tasks, do the tasks. But now doing the task is simple, but why the task happened, how it happened is really hard. I
Exactly.
mean, at least when I
Exactly.
hire people and we kind of try to hire from, young folks to folks who are experts, I think LLMs are great for experts. It actually makes our
Yeah.
life much simpler. But if you're not an expert and you need to become an expert, it kind of requires the rewiring in how you learn and how you think. So, I think every point you make was background.
Yeah, and I
Yeah.
think to add to that, one other advice that I have personally heard and I also try to give forward is if you have an expertise in your niche area, let's say, so I am, I've been doing application security for years now. So I think focusing on your niche area and then trying to see how AI could be used to become more efficient or to kind of automate some of the mundane parts is where I think you'll start seeing, the big differences between people who are like most sought after versus who are not. So yeah, I think this is phenomenal, Vivek. We are running close to our time, so uh, like, is there anything else that you wanted to add to that we haven't covered yet? Any advice
Uh,
for new startup founders? Anything?
yeah. I think, advise startup founders. One of course is, go to the main market, US and others.
Yeah.
The second thing is be patient. I think a lot of first time founders, when they start something, run out of patience, before they start to see any results. And it's very common. The second thing is be very sure that you want to raise funds. It makes sense for your company to actually be able to raise funds. I ran Pentester Academy, the company before that, completely bootstrapped from start to finish till acquisition. And the only reason where, in SquareX, we've raised like bigger rounds is simply because it's a B2B company. It guzzles cash before you can do much. Unless you want to wait for 7 to 8 years for it to grow organically. A lot of founders, the moment I meet them, I think even before they have a prototype, they just talk about like how fast I can raise funding. And I think this is unfortunately a little bit of, contamination of the whole market, because you see a couple of founders do it and it almost becomes a rite to passage. You feel if you raised funds, you're successful, which isn't true at all. On the contrary, it's big responsibility. So that is one. Second is be patient. And third most important thing is go meet folks in your target market, build that advisory group and all of the stuff I was talking about.
Which is great. Vivek, this was a great conversation. We learned a lot. It was like the number of insights per minute were very high.
Yeah.
That's a metric that we
Yeah.
have to-
Thank you.
So, yeah, thank you very much for having us. Thank you very much for being here and love the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Vivek.
Thanks, Anshuman. Thanks, Sanjay. Really appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you for joining us. If you like the show, please share this with your friends and colleagues. If you have any questions or comments, you can reach Anshuman on Twitter at Anshuman_BH. That's ANSHUMAN_BH. And me, Sandesh, at Jubba on Jeans. That's JUBBAONJEANS. See you next time.